My name is Lloyd McKenzie. I'm a consultant with Jevity. I've been doing HL7 for a really long time and doing FHIR since it came out. I'm the initial technical lead for the Structured Data Capture project under ONC, and I'm again the technical lead for SDC Phase 2 funded by NLM. So if it's broken, it's probably my fault. My intentions for this morning's session is to give you a sense of what the original project was about, what we did, what the implementation guide currently supports, and where you might use it. We'll talk a little bit as well about where SDC is going in the new project and some of the additional FHIR capabilities that that's bringing in. Before we get into that, because we don't have any sessions at this particular DevDays that dig into Questionnaire, I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the resources involved in structured data capture. So we have a resource in FHIR called Questionnaire, and that's used to represent forms, surveys, case report forms in the research space, anything where you want to capture a bunch of questions and their corresponding answers. The questionnaire defines the empty form piece, so before any answers are filled in. And it is not specific to any particular form of healthcare, so you can use it for clinical stuff, but you can also use it for claims stuff, for public health, or whatever. It's extremely generic. And it's set up so that you can organize collections of questions in a hierarchical fashion, so you can have groups and subgroups and subgroups if you want to. You can have questions nested inside questions, and you organize them however you like, and you can phrase the question text however you like. You have control over what are the data types for the answers. Are the answers things that have to be filled in, or are they optional? Can you specify multiple answers or only one? You can also specify some conditional logic. So if they say female on question number 2, then maybe that turns on question number 5 and turns off question number 7. So you have that capability within the questionnaire resource. Questionnaire response is the other side. So it represents a particular person filling out that form at a point in time. And you will typically have hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of questionnaire responses associated with a single questionnaire, representing every single time somebody has filled out that form. Questionnaire responses are really useful when you care about the raw data, what the user actually filled in, and when you want to have really tight control over user interface. You want to make sure that the user sees things in a particular order. You want to make sure that they see the specific language that you wanted them to see when they fill in their answer. The challenge with questionnaires is that you can't really compare data across them. If I write up a questionnaire that captures family history and you write up a questionnaire that captures family history, I take my questionnaire responses and your questionnaire responses, and there's no real way to combine those two things together and to compare them, because how you phrased your questions and the types of answers that you were expecting and the order in which you asked them is different than mine. So questionnaire response tends to be a data gathering tool and can be a data analysis tool if all you care about is your particular form. But if you want a general purpose data analysis looking at data captured from different mechanisms, then you're probably going to want to port the data into something else like observation or family member history or one of the other resources that let you query much better than questionnaire response does. Because questionnaire response, you can do a query, say, find me all of the questionnaire responses filled in by patient X of this type. But you can't search on the answers that they gave. There's no ability to do that, and when you start digging into trying to make that work in FHIR, it turns out to be a really, really hard thing because of how questionnaire response works. Last resource we'll touch on just a tiny bit, or two resources actually, are CodeSystem and ValueSet. They do all sorts of weird and wild and wonderful things. We care about them in the questionnaire world because on occasion we will use these resources to define allowed answers. So what is your favorite color? You can define a code system and a value set that lists the colors you want the person to be able to choose from, and you might do that if you want to be able to share answers across multiple questions within a questionnaire or even across multiple questionnaires. You don't have to use code systems and value sets to define your answers, but it does give you a level of reuse that embedding that content directly in the questionnaire does not give you. So that's all background contextual stuff. SDC started out as a US-specific project funded by the Office of the National Coordinator. And they actually ran two separate projects, one within HL7 and one within IHE. And the IHE one got a head start because the ONC folks hadn't really heard of FHIR at the point that they decided that they wanted some standardization in the forms space. And their initial interest was in clinical research. They wanted an improved ability to be able to get the information that is typically captured in the clinical research community using forms into and out of EHRs more easily. So there were two main focuses to that initial project. One was dealing with data elements, and data elements are really fine-grained sort of individual questions that are potentially reusable across forms. So you might have a single data element for systolic blood pressure or patient name or patient gender or something like that. And a lot of research-affiliated organizations had invested a lot of time and effort in building up libraries of these standardized data elements and standardized questions, National Library of Medicine, National Cancer Institute, and others, but they didn't have a good way of sharing them. There was a standard that defined what kinds of characteristics they should have, but not how to actually pass them over the wire, so there was a desire to be able to do that within FHIR. And the other thing that was of interest was leveraging these data elements, somehow figure out a way to take information from EHRs, so Epics and Cerners and Allscripts and whomever else, and use that to fill information into a form. Because if you have the information in the EHR, it saves an awful lot of time and energy if you can automatically fill in parts of or even all of a research form. And it also reduces the chance of people getting it wrong, because of course there's all sorts of transcription errors or people look up the information from the wrong place or whatever. So SDC ended up creating two separate implementation guides, one for the data element piece and one for the questionnaire piece. So where do you find the SDC implementation guide? You start out at the center of the universe, which is hl7.org/FHIR, which presumably you have all visited multiple times this week already. If you go down to the bottom of that page, you will see under external links a section called implementation guides. And the first set of those are the implementation guides that are HL7's fault, or implementation guides produced by people who are members of the FHIR Foundation, which is not quite HL7's fault, but all of the stuff that we do ends up living there. And if you click on that, you will get a big list of implementation guides. It's continuously growing, and we can now filter it a little bit, which is helpful. But near the top, because we're one of the oldest ones, is structured data capture, and those two implementation guides are there. And if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see that for each of them we have two releases. The Standard for Trial Use 2, STU2 based implementation guide, which is on STU of FHIR, and the CI build, which is the continuous integration build, which is whatever I checked in most recently, and is the base for what we're planning to publish this coming, I guess it'll actually publish in August as part of the September ballot cycle, and that we will be looking to publish as part of or alongside FHIR Release 4. So in terms of use cases for structured data capture, data elements are obviously a fairly common notion in the research space. And the notion is you can start to be able to share information that was captured using different forms if those forms actually phrase the questions in the same way. And it turns out that that's sometimes true, sometimes not true. It really depends on how well the data elements themselves are defined and how well the form designers use them appropriately. But at least in theory, it does allow for some reuse across forms. And there is a standard from ISO on what those things look like. With Questionnaire, just like most FHIR resources, it's defined in a very agnostic way. It's not specific to any particular use case. It's not specific to any particular level of sophistication. Everything in it pretty much was optional, and it was also pretty simple in its capabilities. There wasn't a lot of sophistication in terms of how is information displayed, how do you tell that something is instructions or what kind of instructions it is, should something be displayed as checkboxes or radio buttons. None of that was built into the base questionnaire specification because we weren't confident that most systems actually had that level of sophistication. So one of the objectives of SDC was to come up with an implementation guide that set a minimum bar and said, if you want to play in this space, so using questionnaires for research in the US, here is what you need to step up and do. And we defined a number of extensions that gave additional capabilities around rendering. And some of those extensions have since found their way into the core resource because we've decided, you know what, we're actually seeing most implementations leveraging these. So they shouldn't be extensions, they should actually be core elements. But we added quite a bit of capability through extensions, and a lot of that capability is still there in extensions. The other thing is we wanted to be able to fill questionnaires out automatically. And there were two main things that we wanted to be able to do. One is to have EHRs do that themselves. So based on the fact that EHR recognizes a data element, they know what patient gender is, or they know what patient name is, or they know what white blood cell count is, they can then take that information and fill it into the form. Except that there weren't a whole lot of EHR vendors that were involved in participating or interested, because at that point they were madly scrambling to meet meaningful use requirements, and Questionnaire was not on that list, and therefore we weren't top of their priority list. So the second thing that we said was, well, okay, if the EHRs aren't necessarily going to do this, maybe we can have a third party do this. So what happens if we were to have a FHIR operation where we pass the questionnaire reference and we pass a CDA document, because that was the main mechanism for sharing data from EHRs at that point, because they hadn't yet rolled out FHIR, and to some third-party service, and that third-party service would realize that, okay, within a CDA document, I know how to find patient name or patient gender or white blood cell count, and can then fill things into the form. So that was the objective for that. The other thing is that EHR systems didn't even necessarily have the ability to render FHIR questionnaires, which was a bit of a problem. And so we wanted to have a few other options where, in addition to possibly filling out the form, you could also have a third-party service that would render the form, either pass back HTML that the EHR system could then just display in a standard HTML rendering mechanism, or possibly even a redirect where, when you want to fill out this questionnaire, click here, you'll get back a URL where you can redirect the user to, which will display the form, let them fill it out, click submit, and everything sort of gets done without the EHR having to do much work other than send the patient off to a screen. In terms of population, we came up with two different terms. Pre-population is where you have a third party do the filling out of the form, and auto-population is where the EHR does it itself. So if you see pre-population and auto-population in the SDC implementation guide, that's what they're talking about. It's really around who's doing the work. Pre-population is somebody else is doing the work. Auto-population is the EHR is doing it itself. And so we have three different operations in FHIR. Operations are a mechanism for creating a FHIR URL that does something other than just store this stuff. So in this case, you pass in a questionnaire and a patient and maybe a couple of other arguments, and you get back a questionnaire response, or you get back a set of HTML, or you get back a hyperlink that takes you somewhere else where you can fill out those forms. The SDC model is relatively simple. We have a form designer that can create forms. They then reference a data element registry that tells them what are the data elements that could potentially be used. And then you have a form manager that handles the ability to maintain those questionnaires and maintain those value sets. And then on top of that, they have the ability to actually do form population. Turns out that the use cases for SDC are not really research specific. They're also relevant in the public health space, they're relevant in the claims space, any place, even in administration, in fact, a lot in administration. You show up at a clinician, and the first thing that they want you to do is fill out a form, and if you can automatically populate a bunch of your demographic information, you've saved a bunch of time. In order to do that population, we came up with a few different mechanisms. They were all in STU2 driven by data element. So one possibility is that you have an extension directly on each question that says this corresponds to data element X. And the benefit of that is it's nice and simple. The drawback of that is you're expecting the person who designs the questionnaire and maintains the questionnaire to also maintain the mappings. And in a number of organizations, those are actually two very separate things. The people who decide what questions are going to be asked and the people who figure out what is the appropriate formal data element and mapping into something like CDA or whatever that should go there are not necessarily the same type of people, and you might want to maintain those separately. So the alternative that we have is using concept map to maintain those, and that concept map can either be something that's completely separate entity that you have to go look up and find a concept map that ties to your questionnaire, or alternatively, you can have a link inside the questionnaire that says the concept map that defines mappings to data elements for this questionnaire can be found here. And there were strong proponents of all of those approaches, so in the interest of compromise, the specification supports all of them. Unfortunately, nobody implemented any of them. So it turns out that, while great in theory, data element-driven questionnaires and populating questionnaires from that is a hard thing to do. And we did not see a whole lot of uptake. We saw some uptake of the extensions and the general questionnaire rendering capabilities, but not of the population. And part of that as well is levels of indirection. So we are mapping from questionnaire through concept map to a data element, which then has mappings to CDA, which you hope is populated in a consistent way that might actually allow data to flow through in a safe manner. And that's an awful lot of steps where things could possibly go wrong. And it's also an awful lot of complexity for software developers to work with. In the scope of SDC, it was decided to make it US specific, but it turns out that the only portion of SDC that was US specific is the terminology for data elements, because there was a requirement that the formal way that the data elements were defined had to be drawn from LOINC or SNOMED or RxNorm. And I had some challenges with that at the time that the decision was made, but that was not in my control. And it turns out that actually everything in SDC, once you remove that part of data element, is perfectly international in scope. There's nothing in it that is US specific. And of course, other countries do research and claims and administrative stuff as well. One other piece of phase one is that the IHE work ended up diverging a fair bit from the FHIR work, in part because the IHE specification combines the concept of questionnaire and questionnaire response into one resource. FHIR did that as well initially. Initially, we only had one resource that handled both purposes, but in one of the first connectathons we ever held with FHIR, we tried out questionnaire because we thought it was going to be a pretty important thing. And as soon as we started doing somewhat complex questionnaires where we had answers that could repeat and questions that could nest inside each other and repeating groups, it turns out that having the data and the questionnaire definition in the same structure didn't work very well. At least that was our implementers' opinions, and so we split them apart. As well, IHE, of course, is not using the FHIR schema. They created their own syntax for the questionnaires, and that drove a fair bit of complexity because they did not have the same notion that FHIR does of follow the 80% rule, where we include things in the core specification that we believe most systems support. And they drove to support all of the use cases that the stakeholders at the table had, and those were a lot of use cases. So their representation structure is quite sophisticated and also quite open-ended. So it can be a bit challenging to necessarily get two different implementers to do things in the same way. So there were good thoughts behind SDC version 1, and some good work was done, but it didn't actually translate into a lot of implementation. Which brings us to SDC Phase 2. This time it's funded by the US National Library of Medicine, and they did not have a huge interest in the data element part of things, or at least the funder from there didn't have an interest in that part of things. NLMs definitely does have data elements, but this is focused purely on the questionnaire portion of things. First part of the scope is updating SDC to align with R4, because questionnaire has changed a reasonable amount, ValueSet has changed a reasonable amount, and we want implementers who are moving towards newer versions of FHIR to still be able to have guidance around how do you do SDC type things with questionnaire. Second is we decided we're not going to have this as a US specific implementation guide any longer. There wasn't a real reason to do that. Next thing we wanted to do is add in some additional capabilities, because it turns out that we had been a little bit over restrictive in terms of allowing for control of things like calculations, in deciding when questions should be enabled or not. We had some capability which was based on a single answer to a single question, but often you want something more sophisticated than that. You might want to say, if this value is greater than 5.2, then turn this on, and we didn't have that sort of capability. So we've added some more sophistication there. We've added the ability so you can hit a RESTful service to find out what is the list of options to display, such as the list of medications or list of diagnoses or whatever. We can now have a set of questions and a grid of answers, which is a very common format for questions, where you've got A, B, C, D across the top, and questions 1 through 10 down, and you sort of fill in the dots. That wasn't something we could do previously, and we've added that. On more sophisticated side of things, CDA is challenging to map to and from, but there was a huge amount of interest, and we actually had people putting stuff into production that were mapping to and from FHIR, because FHIR is much more consistent in terms of where data lives, and it is focused on computable data at first and foremost, rather than human readable data first and foremost. And so we have a number of implementations that have done mapping to and from FHIR, and we wanted to introduce that. And we also wanted to simplify the path so that you would not have to go from questionnaire to concept map to data element to some mapping to CDA. We wanted to be able to go directly from questionnaire to a FHIR path if that was the way that people wanted to go, or for more sophisticated things, take advantage of a new resource, which is much better at doing mapping because it's a structure-based mapping mechanism. And of course, we're looking at extracting data from structures and putting it into structures. Concept map is really intended for use with mapping terminologies. So it was a bit of a stretch to use it in the first place, and we now have a better tool for the job. So with SDC Phase 2, we're doing simple mappings of just put the path to the resource elements, so patient.gender. You can put that directly on your question, and that tells you where the mapping is. And we have software that knows how to navigate patient.gender and find that information, and we use that in our validators and our publishers now, so that we know that that works. And we also have structure maps, so you can do more sophisticated things like go find me the most recent blood pressure, which is any measurement that has this set of link codes, and translate the value into millimeters of mercury and then fill that in. And that's something that we can now do, whereas we couldn't do that before. And we also have the ability to validate that, yes, this is in fact a valid mapping and that you're not doing crazy things. So that lets us grab data in, but there's also an interest now in the ability to take data that's captured in a questionnaire response and export that information. So you might capture a whole bunch of information about a patient's birth or a maternity record, which tends to be a few procedures, a whole bunch of observations captured over time that are sort of in a bundle. And gathering that data in questionnaire form is relatively natural because you can phrase the questions in a specific way, you can render that information in a specific way, but when you want to start searching and you want to start doing analysis, having the data sitting inside a question and response doesn't help you. You want it inside observations so you can do a nice little graph of what the fetal head size was or whatever it is that you're measuring. And so we're looking at also using these same mapping mechanisms to be able to take data out of a questionnaire response and generate a resource, or more commonly a bundle of resources, so that the data is then available. The last thing that we're doing with SDC Phase 2 is Argonaut project, which is driven by a bunch of EHR vendors and others in the US, is starting to dig into questionnaire as well. And we're wanting to make sure that what we are doing is aligned with what they're doing. They're not biting off quite as much as SDC is, because they're starting small, which makes sense. But we want to make sure that there's a nice path from what they have to what we're designing. If you're interested in structured data capture, we have calls weekly. It's a little bit late, but that's because we've got a bunch of participants from Australia, and we didn't want them to have to wake up too early. You can certainly go and dig into the minutes or see when the call times are, and we welcome more participation. If you would like to review the content, it will be coming up for ballot in September ballot, which means you need to sign up by mid to late-ish August if you want in on that, and we would certainly welcome your feedback. That's where the specification is, as well as where the source is, so you can dig into that as well. And I believe I have some time for questions.
So you had a slide that said, it mentioned a form designer and form manager.
Yep.
Is there an open source tool for that?
There is not. I can absolutely repeat the question. So the question was, are there open source implementations of the various components of SDC, so the form manager and the form designer, et cetera? There is actually an open source tool that the NLM has created. It sort of munges the notion of form designer and form manager together. And I'm not completely sure that it satisfies all of the requirements of that, although they're working towards that. But that is available, and I believe that's JavaScript based. There are a couple, I know Graham has a form designer written in Delphi. I don't know what the license is for that, but if you ping me at my email address, I will dig into that and find out for you. And there are also, there's at least one commercial form designer and form manager that I'm aware of that's available.
When you're talking about commonality of different questions, any thought given to some of the questions that are already in the link, using them across different questionnaires? It seems, from what I've understood, there's an easy way to introduce different questions into the link, and that might be a way to share.
Right. So the question is, when we're looking at reusing questions, have we looked at LOINC as a mechanism for doing that? And absolutely. LOINC is a good example of a set of data elements. And it's one that is actually a bit more computable than most because it is tied into the way that people typically capture information in observations. So you can, in FHIR, specifically say that, by the way, this question corresponds to LOINC code 12345 and do that explicitly within the questionnaire design. So that is something that's available.
For alignment with the Argonaut questionnaire for FHIR versions, so the SDC work going forward is FHIR R4. Assuming Argonaut is going to be part of SDC 3.
I don't know if they've decided that for sure yet. They're just in the early stages of Argonaut questionnaire, and I'm not sure if they've made a firm commitment to one or the other. But from an alignment perspective, the path, if they do settle on R3, the path from R3 to R4 is pretty clear. We know how to do that transformation. So we know what the R4 version of it will look like when that transformation occurs. So we can do the alignment regardless of where they land on that. Other questions?
Has anyone been talking with IHE about aligning again?
Yes. We do have a sometime participant in SDC calls. He's missed the last few. I got to follow up and see exactly where he's at. But he's been engaged with IHE throughout. And the initial phases of SDC Phase 2 have been heads down. Here's a bunch of change requests that have come in that we need to get through. But absolutely once we've gone through that process and figured out what it is that we want things to look like, the next step is to take a look at where IHE has evolved to and see, are there places where we can make it easier to bridge between the two specifications. And if you're interested in coming to help out with that, we won't turn you away.
That's not the part of IHE I know.
Okay.
We have people here who talk to Emma.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. I think I've actually got another 7 minutes, but I don't remember. So let me quickly check when I'm supposed to finish. 10:30. I do have 7 more minutes. So let me subject you to a tour of the SDC specification. Yes, sir. Okay. In terms of SDC Phase 2, it's not really fully baked, so that's hard to say. We have commitments for adoption from a few different organizations. So Graham will be supporting it, NLM will be supporting it, Brian intends to support it in the questionnaire work that he's done in Australia, and we're getting more interest from the Argonaut vendors, although again they're moving more slowly, but the alignment has indicated some interest, and we're actually having a special session with some of them following DevDays, talking about where questionnaire fits. because there's a number of problem areas in healthcare where questionnaire seems to fit squarely in the middle, and we need to figure out how to solve them, because there's a number of people coming to us saying we need a resource to deal with worker history, we need a resource to deal with maternal care, we need a resource to deal with X and Y and Z, and all of these areas we think of from a pure FHIR perspective, well, that's a collection of observations, or that's a collection of observations and procedures. And if we start creating separate resources for each of these things, rather than 100-ish resources, we're going to end up with 1,000-ish resources, which is not sustainable. And it also makes it hard for us to manage the data, where sometimes it lives as observations and sometimes it lives in these other things. And we think that questionnaire is at the core of the solution to that, but we haven't quite landed exactly what that looks like. As we do land that, it's going to, I can't reach my implementation guide. Well, that could be a short demonstration. That's okay. I have a local hard drive.
So what I'm trying to get a sense of is if you're collecting data using a questionnaire, that seems the thing.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of want you to be creating observations instead of questionnaire responses.
Well, there's a need for both. So, when you're doing direct data entry or direct data capture from a human, questionnaires are a very nice way of doing that. And simply being able to throw a questionnaire up, or the equivalent of a questionnaire up in a Smart on FHIR app or in an iPhone app or whatever, and guide the user through, how are you feeling today? Did this happen? Did that happen? Questionnaire is a natural way of representing that, but what we want is for it to be very straightforward. If we've already got observations that can be used to fill some of that in, to make that happen, and also when it's filled out, if the natural state in FHIR for that information to be analyzed and manipulated is as observations or medication statements or whatever, to be able to push that data into those things and fill them out properly. Mm-hmm.
So what would potentially make sense to me is that if it's person who's creating a questionnaire knows that somebody answers that questionnaire can populate an observation resource. Is there a way in questionnaires to potentially link that so that it absolutely can happen clearly? Like, okay, this question, this answer goes here, this observation resource, and I can put all of that when I build my questionnaire so that it generates that observation resource where appropriate.
Rob has just described exactly what SDC is trying to do. So the intention is absolutely that as you're designing your questionnaire, you are embedding in that questionnaire linkages that say, hey, this particular group within the questionnaire corresponds to an observation, and this corresponds to the date, and this corresponds to the value, and this corresponds to the interpretation. And to then be able to essentially hit a button and take that questionnaire response and create a bundle that contains 5 or 15 or 50 different observation instances that reflect the information that's inside that questionnaire response, that you can then submit off to a FHIR server, use in decision support, do trending on, do statistics on, all of the things that are, absolutely. And I mean, and ideally, you would also create a provenance record that says, by the way, this observation or this set of observations came from this questionnaire response. So you then have that traceability of, here's what the user actually saw and filled in, and here is the more computable form of the data that we're driving decisions off of. All right, so this is what SDC implementation guide looks like. You can click on the artifact index to see the different systems involved. You can profiles are not rendering. I have to fix that apparently. And you can take a look at some of the operations that we've defined, take a look at some of the example instances. This is a draft version. It's not necessarily fully baked yet because we are working on draft 2, but wanted to give you a heads up in terms of what's coming. And if you are interested, I'm here for the rest of the day. Come and talk to me, or come show up on a call. You will be most welcome. Thank you.